A homeless black man saves a white child. From an accident, only to discover the boy's father is a racist politician who has to confront his beliefs. The air was cool and crisp, the sun hanging low in the autumn sky, casting long shadows over the city streets. People hurried past, their lives moving forward without a second glance at the man sitting on the park bench. His coat old and frayed, his hands tucked into the pockets to ward off the cold. Malik had long grown used to being invisible, blending into the background of a world that had forgotten him. He leaned back against the hard wood of the bench, his eyes scanning the busy street ahead. There was always something to watch. People rushing by, cars honking, life continuing. For Malik, the park was a refuge, a place where he could sit without being chased away, where he could watch the world move on while he remained still. As the minutes ticked by, Malik's mind wandered. Memories of a life he once knew, of a family, a job, hopes and dreams that seemed like distant echoes. He had once been a man with a future, but life had a way of derailing even the best laid plans. Suddenly, the sharp squeal of tires snapped Malik out of his thoughts. His eyes darted toward the sound, and that's when he saw him. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, his eyes locked on a soccer ball that had rolled into the street. The boy's foot lifted, his small body leaning forward, ready to chase after it. Malik's heart raced as his body moved before his mind could catch up. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of the city. He pushed off the bench, his legs carrying him toward the boy as the distant sound of an engine roared closer. Malik's breath came in sharp bursts as he sprinted toward the child. The boy took a step into the street, oblivious to the car speeding toward him. Malik reached out, his fingers wrapping around the boy's jacket, just in time to pull him back onto the sidewalk. The car whizzed by, the driver oblivious to the near tragedy that had just unfolded. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The boy's wide eyes stared up at Malik, his small hands still clutching the soccer ball to his chest. "You okay, kid?" Malik asked, his voice breathless but calm. The boy blinked, nodding slowly. "Yeah. I didn't see it," he whispered, his voice shaky. Malik knelt down to the boy's level, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You've got to be careful, man. That was too close." The boy swallowed hard, his face still pale from the shock, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. Malik offered a small smile, giving the boy's shoulder a gentle squeeze before rising to his feet. Just as Malik stood, the sound of a car door slamming broke through the moment. A sleek black SUV had pulled up to the curb, and a man in an expensive suit was striding toward them, his face flushed with anger and panic. "Ethan!" the man shouted, his voice trembling with fury as he reached the boy. "What the hell were you thinking?" Ethan flinched at his father's tone, shrinking back as the man grabbed his arm, pulling him close. I didn't see the car," the boy stammered, his voice barely audible. The man's face was a mixture of relief and rage, his grip on his son tight as he knelt to inspect him for any sign of injury. After a tense moment, the man looked up, his sharp gaze landing on Malik for the first time. Malik could feel the weight of the man's eyes on him, the way they quickly swept over his worn clothes, his weathered face, and the recognition that followed. "Thank you," the man said stiffly, his voice clipped and formal. There was no warmth, no genuine gratitude in his tone, only the strained politeness of someone doing what was expected. Malik could see it in the man's eyes, the flicker of disdain, the subtle tightening of his jaw. This was not a man who saw a hero. This was a man who saw a problem. Malik shrugged, shoving his hands back into his pockets. "Just glad the kid's all right," he muttered, stepping back slightly as the man straightened, pulling his son to his side protectively, Malik stood a few feet away, feeling the familiar distance that came with people like this man. It was as if the very air between them thickened with unspoken judgment. He had done what anyone should have done, saved a child. But the way the man looked at him now, it felt like Malik had crossed some invisible line. "Come on, Ethan, we're leaving," the man said firmly, his hand tightening around his son's shoulder. Ethan, still wide-eyed, looked back at Malik, his lips parting as if to say something, but his father pulled him away too quickly. "Dad, wait," the boy started, but the man cut him off. "Not now, Ethan," the man snapped, ushering him toward the SUV. Ethan shot a glance back at Malik, his small face filled with confusion and gratitude, before his father shoved him into the car and slammed the door. The man turned back toward Malik, hesitating for a brief second. "I appreciate what you did for my son," he said, though his words felt hollow. "But, if you don't mind, stay away from him." There it was. The truth behind the man's stiff demeanor. Malik's stomach tightened, but he said nothing, only nodding slightly. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him like that, and it wouldn't be the last. The man gave one final look before getting back into his car. The sleek vehicle roared to life, pulling away from the curb with a quiet hum, leaving Malik standing alone on the sidewalk. He stood there for a moment longer, watching the SUV disappear into the distance, feeling the cold wind bite through his thin coat. Malik had saved a life today, but somehow it left him feeling more invisible than ever. Days passed, and life in the park resumed its usual rhythm. Malik returned to his spot beneath the large oak tree, watching the world go by as he always did. The memory of the boy, Ethan, lingered in his mind, though he never expected to see him again. Malik had learned long ago that people like Ethan and his father didn't cross paths with people like him. But one afternoon, as the shadows began to stretch across the park, Malik noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the playground. It was Ethan, alone this time, clutching his soccer ball and scanning the park as if looking for someone. Malik hesitated, unsure if he should approach, but before he could make a decision, Ethan spotted him. The boy's face lit up with recognition, and without a moment's hesitation he ran toward Malik. "Hey," Ethan called out, skidding to a stop in front of him, slightly out of breath. Malik raised an eyebrow, surprised at the boy's enthusiasm. "Hey, kid," Malik replied, his tone cautious. He glanced around, half expecting to see Ethan's father storming toward them. Ethan smiled shyly, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I've been looking for you," he said. "I wanted to say thanks, for the other day." Malik's eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. "You don't need to thank me, just glad you're all right." Ethan kicked at the ground awkwardly, then looked up at Malik with wide eyes. "My dad, he doesn't like me talking to strangers," he admitted, glancing over his shoulder as if to make sure his father wasn't there. "But I wanted to find you. You saved my life." Malik chuckled softly, though there was a touch of sadness in his voice. "Your dad's just trying to protect you. I get it." The boy frowned, his young face showing a complexity beyond his years. "But you're not a bad person. Why doesn't he want me to talk to you?" Malik wasn't sure how to answer. He had faced this question many times in his life, though never from a child. How could he explain to this boy the invisible barriers people like his father put up? Barriers built on fear, prejudice, and misunderstandings that ran too deep for one conversation to fix. "It's complicated," Malik finally said, his voice gentle. "Sometimes people, they just don't understand things the way they should." Ethan nodded slowly, though it was clear he didn't fully understand. Still, he sat down beside Malik on the bench, hugging his soccer ball to his chest. "I think it's dumb," Ethan muttered under his breath. Malik glanced down at the boy, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," he said softly. "Sometimes it is." Over the next few days, Ethan kept coming back to the park, each time a little more eager to talk to Malik. He would sit beside him, sometimes asking questions, other times just enjoying the quiet company. Malik found himself looking forward to their short conversations. There was something refreshing about the boy's innocence, the way he saw the world without the filters of prejudice that his father carried. But Malik knew it couldn't last. One afternoon, as Ethan sat beside him, their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice, sharp, angry, and filled with tension. "Ethan, what the hell are you doing?" Malik's heart sank as he looked up to see Ethan's father, James West, storming across the park toward them, his face twisted with rage. Ethan jumped to his feet, the soccer ball slipping from his hands. "Dad, I told you to stay away from him," James shouted, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him back. His eyes, cold and furious, locked onto Malik. "I don't want you near my son, do you hear me?" Malik stood, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I wasn't trying to cause any trouble," he said calmly. "Your son came to me." "I don't care," James snapped, his voice shaking with fury. "You don't belong here. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not going to let you—" "Dad, stop!" Ethan cried, his small voice cutting through the tension. He looked up at his father, tears welling in his eyes. "He saved me, remember. He's not a bad person." James hesitated, his grip on Ethan's arm loosening slightly. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Confusion, maybe even guilt. But it was quickly replaced by the cold mask of authority he wore so well. "I don't care what he did," James said through gritted teeth. "We're leaving." He turned, pulling Ethan along, but the boy resisted. "Dad, you don't understand," Ethan shouted, tears streaming down his face now. "He's my friend." The words hung in the air like a punch, stopping both James and Malik in their tracks. Malik's heart ached as he saw the pain in Ethan's eyes, the confusion and hurt swirling inside him. And for the first time, James seemed to falter. For a moment, the tension in the air was palpable. James stood frozen, his hand still gripping Ethan's arm, but the fire in his eyes had dimmed slightly. Malik watched, his chest tightening as he saw the conflict playing out on James's face. It was clear that James was torn, not by what Malik had done, but by what Ethan had just said. Friend. That one word seemed to hang between them, cutting through the layers of anger and fear. Ethan's innocent declaration was so simple, yet so powerful. To him, Malik wasn't just some homeless man or a stranger. He was someone who had shown kindness, someone who mattered. James blinked, his grip loosening on his son's arm. He let out a long breath, his eyes darting between Ethan and Malik. For the first time since the accident, James' posture softened ever so slightly. "Ethan, you don't understand," he began, his voice quieter now, less certain. "People like him." Malik felt a familiar knot form in his stomach at those words. People like him. He'd heard that phrase his whole life. People like him didn't belong, didn't deserve the same respect or kindness. People like him were trouble. Ethan, however, didn't seem to care. He pulled his arm away from his father's grip, stepping closer to Malik. "You don't even know him," Ethan cried, his voice shaking with frustration. "He's a good person, Dad. He saved my life. You wouldn't even be here if it weren't for him." James opened his mouth to argue, but stopped short. The weight of Ethan's words seemed to settle over him like a heavy blanket. He looked down at his son, then back at Malik, and for the first time, the anger in his eyes faded. It was replaced by something else, something more complicated. Guilt? Confusion? Malik couldn't tell. After a long, tense silence, James finally spoke again, his voice low and strained. "Ethan, go wait by the car." Ethan hesitated, glancing at Malik before reluctantly nodding. He picked up his soccer ball and walked toward the black SUV parked at the edge of the park, but not before giving Malik a small, sad smile. It was a look that said, "I'm sorry." Once Ethan was out of earshot, James turned to Malik. His expression was no longer filled with fury, but there was still tension in his jaw, his body rigid with discomfort. "Look," James began, his voice tight. "I don't know what you're trying to do, but I don't want my son involved in whatever this is." Malik raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "Whatever this is," he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "I saved your son's life. That's all there is to it." James crossed his arms, his gaze hardening once more. "I appreciate that," he said, though his tone was still cold. "But people like you—" "There it is again," Malik interrupted, his voice sharp now. "People like me. What exactly do you mean by that?" James hesitated, his face flushing with frustration. "You know what I mean," he said quietly, his eyes avoiding Malik's. "No, I don't," Malik shot back, stepping forward. "Why don't you spell it out for me?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. James' face twisted with discomfort, as if he didn't want to admit what was bubbling under the surface. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've seen guys like you before," he muttered. "You're on the streets for a reason. You can't expect me to just let you be around my son." Malik's jaw clenched. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I get it," he said quietly. "You think because I'm homeless, I'm dangerous. You think because I'm black, I'm some kind of threat." James flinched at Malik's words, but he didn't deny it. The silence between them was thick and uncomfortable. "You don't know anything about me," Malik continued, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "You don't know how I ended up here. You don't know the choices I had to make, and you sure as hell don't know what kind of person I am." James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes still avoiding Malik's. "Maybe," he muttered, "but I have to protect my son." Malik nodded slowly, understanding the fear behind James's words, even if he didn't agree with them. "I get that," he said, his voice softening. "But your son, he sees things differently. He doesn't see me the way you do." James glanced over at Ethan, who was sitting in the back seat of the SUV, watching them through the window. His face softened for a moment, but when he looked back at Malik, the hardness returned. "I'm not going to risk it," he said firmly. "Stay away from my son." With that, James turned and walked back to the car, leaving Malik standing alone by the bench. Malik watched him go, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He knew the conversation wasn't over. Not really. But for now, all he could do was watch as the SUV pulled away, taking Ethan, and any hope of understanding, with it. The days that followed were quiet. Malik returned to his usual spot in the park, but he didn't expect to see Ethan again. James had made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with Malik, and Malik wasn't the type to push where he wasn't wanted. But one afternoon, as Malik sat on the bench, lost in thought, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Hey." Malik looked up, surprised to see Ethan standing in front of him, his soccer ball tucked under his arm. The boy was alone again, but this time there was a look of determination in his eyes. "I thought your dad told you to stay away," Malik said, raising an eyebrow. Ethan shrugged, kicking at the dirt. "He's at work. He doesn't know I'm here." Malik frowned, glancing around. You shouldn't be out here alone, kid. What if something happens? I'm fine, Ethan said stubbornly, sitting down on the bench beside Malik. I wanted to see you. I don't care what my dad says. Malik let out a sigh, unsure of what to do. He didn't want to make things harder for the kid, but it was clear that Ethan wasn't going to leave. You shouldn't be here, Ethan, Malik said gently. Your dad's just trying to protect you. Ethan shook his head, his face twisted with frustration. My dad doesn't know anything, he muttered. He's wrong about you. Malik smiled sadly, but he didn't argue. Maybe, he said quietly, but that's not for me to decide. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Malik with wide eyes. Can you tell me more about you? He asked, his voice soft and sincere. I want to know why my dad is wrong. Malik hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not to a kid, but there was something in Ethan's eyes that made him want to open up, if only just a little. I used to have a life, like everyone else, Malik began, his voice low. I had a job, a family, but things don't always go the way you plan. I made some mistakes, trusted the wrong people, and, well, I ended up here. Ethan listened intently, his eyes never leaving Malik's face. That doesn't make you a bad person, he said quietly. Malik smiled, a warmth spreading through his chest. No, it doesn't, he agreed softly. But sometimes people don't see it that way. Ethan looked up at him, determination flashing in his eyes. But I'll try. Ethan sat beside Malik, absorbing every word. It was clear that the boy was struggling to reconcile the image of Malik he had in his head with the version of the world his father had painted for him. Why don't people see it that way? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Why does my dad hate you so much? Malik's heart ached at the innocence behind the question. He knew that the world Ethan lived in was different, one where color and status didn't define people, at least not yet, but he also knew that as Ethan grew older, he would start to see the invisible lines drawn between people like Malik and people like his father. Your dad doesn't hate me, Malik said gently, though he wasn't entirely sure of that himself. He just doesn't understand. People fear what they don't understand, and sometimes it's easier for them to make judgments than to take the time to see the truth. Ethan frowned, looking down at his soccer ball. That's not fair. No, Malik agreed, his voice soft. It's not. But that's the world we live in, kid. They sat in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. Malik wasn't sure how much Ethan really understood, but the boy's sincerity touched him in a way he hadn't expected. Finally, Ethan spoke again, his voice small. I'm going to make my dad understand. Malik smiled sadly, shaking his head. It's not that simple. People don't change because you tell them to. Later that evening, Ethan sat at the dinner table, pushing his food around on his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. His father, James, sat across from him, scrolling through his phone, seemingly oblivious to his son's mood. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Malik. He wanted so badly for his father to see what he saw. A kind man, a man who had saved him, a man who didn't deserve to be treated like he was less than human. Dad? Ethan asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence. James didn't look up from his phone. Yeah? Why do you hate Malik? The question hit James like a punch. His hand froze over the screen, and he slowly looked up, his face tight with surprise and irritation. What did you say? Ethan bit his lip, but he wasn't going to back down. You told me to stay away from him because he's different. But he's not a bad person. He saved my life. Why do you hate him? James set his phone down, leaning back in his chair as he stared at his son. He wasn't sure how to respond. Part of him wanted to shut down the conversation, to tell Ethan he didn't understand, that it wasn't his place to question these things. But another part of him, the part that had been nagging at him since the day Malik had pulled Ethan from the street, knew that Ethan's question deserved an answer. "I don't hate him," James said slowly, though the words felt hollow. "It's just, people like him. They come from a different world, Ethan. You don't know what they've been through, the kind of trouble they attract." Ethan frowned, shaking his head. "He doesn't attract trouble. You don't even know him, Dad." James let out a long sigh, rubbing his temple. "Look, I know you think he's your friend, but he is my friend," Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling. "And you don't get to say he's not just because he's different." James was taken aback by his son's sudden outburst. He stared at Ethan, his chest tightening with guilt. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He was just trying to protect his son, to keep him away from a world he didn't understand. But deep down, James knew that Ethan was right. He didn't know Malik. All he saw when he looked at the man was the surface. A homeless black man, a stranger who didn't fit into their world. And that had been enough to make a judgment. James sighed, feeling the weight of his son's words. "All right," he said finally, his voice softer now. "Tell me about him." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You mean you'll listen?" James nodded, leaning forward slightly. "I want to hear what you see in him." Ethan's face lit up, and he began to tell his father everything. About Malik's kindness, how he saved him, how he never asked for anything in return. He told James about the conversations they'd had, about how Malik wasn't like the people his father thought he was. Ethan spoke with such passion, such innocence, that James couldn't help but listen. For the first time, James felt a crack in the walls he had built around his beliefs. Could it be that he had been wrong? Could it be that Malik was more than just the sum of his circumstances? When Ethan finished speaking, James sat back in his chair, staring at the table in silence. He didn't know what to say. His son's words had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. "I want to see him again," Ethan said quietly. "Please, Dad, just once. Will you come with me?" James hesitated. Part of him wanted to say no, to stick to the beliefs he had held for so long. But another part of him, the part that had been listening to his son with an open heart, knew that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let those beliefs go. After a long pause, James nodded. "All right," he said softly. "We'll go see him." The next day, James and Ethan returned to the park, where Malik sat in his usual spot beneath the oak tree. Ethan spotted him first, his face lighting up as he ran ahead, but James lagged behind, feeling a knot of tension forming in his chest. As they approached, Malik looked up, surprised to see them both. His eyes flicked to James, wary and unsure. Ethan ran to Malik's side, smiling wide. "Hey, I told my dad about you. He wants to talk to you." Malik's gaze shifted to James, who stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his posture stiff. There was an awkward silence as the two men regarded each other, the tension from their last encounter still hanging in the air. Finally, James took a step forward, clearing his throat. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I judged you without knowing anything about you. That wasn't right." Malik raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. He hadn't expected this. "I appreciate that," Malik said slowly, though there was a guarded edge to his tone. "But you don't owe me anything." James shook his head, his face tightening with regret. "No, I do. I've been thinking a lot about what my son said, about how he sees you, and I realize that I've been looking at you through my own biases." He paused, glancing down at the ground, the weight of the admission heavy on his shoulders. Malik stayed quiet, letting James continue. "I didn't want him to see the world I grew up in, the one where people are divided by race, status, and everything else. I thought I was protecting him, but maybe I was teaching him the wrong thing." Malik crossed his arms, his expression softening slightly. He had seen men like James before, men who clung to their power, their beliefs, because it was easier than admitting they were wrong. But this was different. James was trying. Ethan looked up at his father, hope shining in his eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," James continued, his voice quiet. "I just want to say I'm sorry. And if there's anything I can do to make things right, I want to try." Malik studied James for a long moment, the silence between them filled with unspoken tension. He wasn't sure if James' apology would change anything, but there was something in the man's eyes, something Malik hadn't seen before. It wasn't pity or condescension. It was sincerity. After what felt like an eternity, Malik finally nodded. "All right," he said softly. "Let's start with a conversation." The three of them sat together on the bench beneath the oak tree, Malik, James, and Ethan. The conversation was awkward at first, filled with pauses and hesitant words, but as the minutes passed, it became easier. Malik shared more of his story, how he had once been a mechanic, how he had a family, how a series of bad decisions and unfortunate circumstances had led him to the streets. He didn't ask for sympathy, he simply told the truth. James listened, really listened, for the first time. As Malik spoke, James began to see the man behind the worn clothes and weathered face. He saw someone who had struggled, someone who had made mistakes, but who was still trying to do good in a world that had given him little in return. Ethan chimed in every now and then, asking questions, his curiosity driving the conversation forward. His innocence and kindness bridged the gap between the two men, making it easier for them to connect. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, something had shifted between them. They weren't friends, not yet, but they were no longer enemies. There was a sense of understanding, of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. As they stood to leave, James turned to Malik, his expression serious but sincere. "I don't know what your plans are," he said quietly, "but if you ever need help, a job, a place to stay, I can try to help." Malik smiled faintly, though there was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "I appreciate that," he said, "but I've got a long way to go before I'm ready for that." James nodded, understanding. "Just know that the offer's there." Malik watched as James and Ethan walked away, the boy waving enthusiastically as they disappeared into the distance. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. And as the park grew quiet, Malik sat back down beneath the oak tree, his heart a little lighter than it had been before.